Let's dive into an idea that might just change how you look at every single decision you make. We're going to rethink the whole idea of what choice even is and see if we can separate it from that feeling of conflict. I mean, think about it. The last big decision you had to make, did it feel heavy? You know that feeling, right? Weighing the options, making the pro-con lists, second-guessing everything. It's like this internal tug of war. And for most of us, that is the feeling of making a choice. It's a struggle. But what if that whole assumption is just wrong? What if all that conflict isn't actually a necessary part of making a good decision? What if it's just a symptom of something else going on completely under the surface?
So, to find a better way, we first got to understand why our choices feel so heavy to begin with. When you're stuck, totally paralyzed by a decision, what are you actually weighing?
Well, when you really look at it, the struggle is almost never about the options themselves. It's not really about job A versus job B. It's about these deeper, kind of hidden questions we're asking ourselves. We're filtering everything through our identity, our fear of making the wrong choice, and our deep need to feel safe. And that's the absolute heart of it. The real conflict isn't out there between the options, it's inside us. We've tied the outcome of the choice to our very sense of self. So every decision becomes this high-stakes vote on who we are and who we're going to be, and man, that is a ton of pressure.
Okay, so this brings us to this idea of the inner negotiation, because as we're seeing, the conflict isn't about the options, it's about us.
Yeah, check this out. This lays it out so clearly. On the surface, you're choosing between taking a new job or staying put. But the real conflict? That's your ambitious self battling your cautious self. Or, the adventurous part of you that wants to move to a new city versus the part of you that craves security. That's where all the friction comes from. And, we get into this big internal battle. Because honestly, it feels like the right thing to do. It feels responsible. It feels like we're being careful and giving the decision the serious thought it deserves. But here's the catch. There's a hidden cost. All of that endless negotiating, that feeling of being careful, is really just a low-grade state of stress. It keeps your nervous system on high alert, in that fight-or-flight mode, and it just drains your energy for days, maybe even weeks. So, if that's the problem, what's the solution? How do we get out of that loop? Well, this next section is about a really deep shift, where that whole internal battlefield just disappears.
The whole thing starts when something called self-reference begins to soften. And all that really means is that our attachment to a particular story about me, our identity, it just starts to loosen its grip.
And when that happens, the first thing to go is this constant need to protect yourself. If a choice isn't seen as some threat or some big boost to your fragile ego, well, there's nothing left to defend. The second thing that fades is that intense pressure to always be optimizing. We stop looking at every choice as this critical building block for some perfect future version of ourselves. That burden of getting it right just gets lifted. And when you take those two things away, the result is pretty profound. Without an identity to protect or a future self to build, the entire foundation for that inner conflict just crumbles. The debate just stops. So what does a choice look like without all that baggage? It's actually incredibly simple and practical. Okay, so first, the options still show up. And second, you still evaluate them based on, reality. But then, one option just fits better. It aligns. So you take it, and then the whole process is just over. The mental gymnastics, the second guessing, it's all gone. All right, let's talk about a new kind of responsibility. Clarity without carelessness. Because I know what some of you are probably thinking right now. Does being this simple mean being careless or impulsive? Let's tackle that. This is such a natural reaction, isn't it? We're so used to thinking that hard equals important or thorough. So when a choice feels easy, we get suspicious. We start asking ourselves, wait, am I missing something? Shouldn't I be struggling with this more? But this is a huge, huge reframe. That feeling of difficulty, it was never proof that you were being wise. It was only ever proof that you were experiencing a lot of internal friction and strain. Clarity, not struggle, is the real sign of a well-aligned decision. And let's be really clear, this is not about avoiding responsibility, not at all.
You still live with the outcomes of your choices, and if a decision doesn't work out as planned, you're still the one who has to adapt and respond to what's happening. And this right here perfectly captures that final shift. Responsibility stops being this heavy, tense feeling you carry around in your head and shoulders. Instead, it just becomes a practical function, something you handle out in the world, not a weight you bear inside yourself. So, if we boil it all down, the big takeaway is this. We've all mistakenly assumed that the feeling of conflict is the same thing as the process of choosing, but they're not the same. Decisions can be clear, simple, and totally functional without all that internal drama. And that leaves us with one last, pretty fascinating question to chew on. We just looked at how the feeling of conflict can be separated from the function of choice. So, what if we applied that same logic to effort? Is it possible that the feeling of straining and trying so hard is also unnecessary for the actual function of getting something done? Something to think about.